afternoon, everyone. Please give me a thumbs up if your audio is coming through loud and clear. Thank you. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the in-flight entertainment.
2, 1, 0. Ignition and liftoff. Let's go, Falcon, for number 10.
Good day, everybody, and welcome to Team Kairos' presentation of Starlink, a subsidiary of SpaceX and soon to be its own independent company. Team Kairos consists of Ken from the United States Coast Guard with a background in naval engineering, Charles, a surface warfare officer from the United States Navy, and myself, Ben, a naval aviation maintenance officer.
Good day, classmates. Our first section will be a short history review of satellite technology and satellite internet. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the decade list here to your right. I'll let you peruse those at your own leisure. Then we'll go through a quick list of the main points over the last few decades. That brings us to 2018, where the FCC licensed Starlink. They're currently producing 120 satellites a month and deploying them on their Falcon rockets. Throughout this video, you will see the distribution of 60 satellites at a time. Current numbers ranging just below 2,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. We're now going to have a quick run through of available connections to internet on Earth, starting with dial-up. Dial-up, as you know, back in the day, is on the landline to your home, but you cannot use the phone at the same time you use the internet, and the speeds are extremely slow. Then came DSL, where you could use internet and the phone on the same connection. Then you have the normal cell phone towers, 4G and the 5G that we are all familiar with nowadays. Then there's cable internet coming through a coax cable to your home via provider. And the fastest on the ground is fiber optics, which utilizes fiber cables instead of copper wires. You transfer these on light waves instead of electricity, which makes it a lot quicker. Here's a chart with the types of connections, their speeds, and their average monthly costs over providers. Now, satellite here says it's up to 100 megabytes per second. This is the market that Starlink is going to encroach upon. With satellites, you have a ground station that connects to satellite in orbit, and then down to your satellite dish in your home. Now, Starlink would be a little bit different here. There'll be approximately 100 ground stations across the continental United States, and then also with the amount of satellites they're putting up, there will always be 5 connected to each other via lasers. Now these lasers will send, because they're in vacuum, send data a lot faster and get a lot quicker to the nearest ground station. Now Starlink is a LEO orbit, which is a low Earth orbit. It's a lot closer than the geosynchronous orbits for normal satellites. Currently, Starlink is launching 60 satellites at a time via its Falcon rocket. You can see here, everybody remembers Elon Musk launching a Roadster into space. That is comparison on the right there to 60 satellites compressed inside the nose cone. And on the left there is the module launching astronauts to the International Space Station, which they had just completed, marking the longest space voyage. Here's the current constellation size for Earth, with the US in the lead with just over 1,000 satellites. But as you can see on the right here, the planned constellation will put us up to 42,000 satellites. The most recent update with their satellites is their new configuration of not facing their solar arrays towards the Earth on one orientation, but going vertically. This is to keep the reflection of the sun going back down to Earth, where people on the ground and astronomers can be able to see them. They're also putting sunblocks on the sides, as well as painting the bottom black.
I mean, first of all, why go anywhere, right? I think there are really two fundamental paths. History is going to bifurcate along two directions. One path is we stay on Earth forever, and then there will be some eventual extinction event. I don't have an immediate doomsday prophecy, but it's eventually, history suggests there will be some doomsday event. The alternative is to become a spacefaring civilization and a multi-planet species, which I hope you would agree that is the right way to go. Because in '69 we were able to go to the moon, and the space shuttle could get to low Earth orbit, and then obviously the space shuttle got retired, but that trend line is down to zero. So I think what a lot of people don't appreciate is that technology does not automatically improve. It only improves if a lot of really strong engineering talent is applied to the problem that it improves.
SpaceX's super-fast broadband service. The internet venture is said to bring in around $22 billion in profits yearly by 2025. Who needs investors when you can sell the world's most sought-after commodity, Wi-Fi?
In terms of our payload, Starlink is a satellite internet constellation designed and manufactured by us here at SpaceX that can provide a high-speed, low-latency internet to people living in remote and rural locations around the globe. To date, over 500,000 people have placed an order or put down a deposit for Starlink service, and with every launch, we get closer to connecting more people across the world. And you see it right there, actually. Those satellites are starting to slowly extend. And shortly after this, they're going to deploy their individual solar arrays, and over the next few days and weeks, they're going to distance themselves from each other and use their onboard ion thrusters to make their way to their specific operational orbits.
In a filing to the FCC, SpaceX said that Starlink services, quote, meeting and exceeding speeds of 100 megabits per second for downloads and 20 megabits per second for uploads. Musk has said that he expects the service will double in speed by the end of the year. To do this, the company is developing a technology known as inter-satellite links.
The basic premise is that you have an optical sensor, which is effectively a laser, that points from one satellite and connects to another optical sensor on another satellite and creates this, unseen path from one to the other. That's this stable connection, almost like a wire. And if you have that stable connection, you can drastically increase the speed because you're now moving signal from one satellite to the other at the speed of light rather than the speed of whatever's on the ground.
In the past, Starlink's been used by emergency responders in Washington, where the satellites are manufactured to set up an internet connection in areas devastated by wildfires. The U.S. Air Force and the Army are also both testing Starlink.
The interesting thing about the funding power for Starlink is that they are both self-funded through a parent company, SpaceX, and also funded through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which allowed them to tap into taxpayer money to fund their program. Recently, SpaceX was awarded $885.5 million worth of federal subsidies. While this was a big win for Starlink, it may be important to consider that SpaceX only won about a tenth of the $9.2 billion in funds awarded to over 180 companies. In fact, Musk company ranked as the fourth highest awardee in terms of dollar value, second to LTD Broadband, Charter Communications, and Rural Electric Cooperative Consortium. According to the FCC, the subsidies will be distributed over the next 10 years in the form of equal monthly payments, so as long as each provider meets all deployment milestones. When it comes to sources of revenue, Starlink intends to build a customer base primarily of tech giants and independent users. This past October, Starlink announced a partnership with Microsoft to connect their tech giant's Azure cloud computing network to the Starlink satellite networks. SpaceX and Microsoft in recent months have been testing the software needed to connect Starlink and Azure and anticipate upon completion a very profitable market. Also, according to Forbes, independent user market seems to have a bright future as well. Forbes projects that the global population will grow to a little over 8 billion by 2025, just under 1% compound annual growth rate. With internet penetration rising to 72% in the same time frame, this would imply that 5.8 billion people will be online by 2025. Forbes estimates that Starlinks will garner about 0.1% of all new internet users by 2021, with the number rising to 2.3% by 2025 as coverage scales up. This would imply that the company new subscriber adds will scale up from 0.2 million in 2021 to about 5.6 million by 2025, estimating a total Starlink user base as in 2025 at about 14.4 million. Forbes also projects that with the $100 fee, the monthly annual revenue for a user for Starlink will stand at $60 based on the company's internal estimates for revenues and subscribers made back in 2017. This would imply annual revenues of about $10 billion by 2025. While all of the data points to the fact that Starlink is hitting all of their target objectives, just like any other startup company, there are barriers to entry that Starlink must overcome. The first challenge Starlink's face is the high capital cost. Despite heavy support and investments provided to build Starlink, the company's leadership estimates Starlink will still need approximately $10 billion or more dollars to transition to the actual launching phase. Right now, there are not any known available federal subsidies being provided to the company, and so the company is having to push to raise private investment funding to transition to the launching phase. The latter three barriers to entry as it relates to Starlink, competition, master of technology, and the slight learning curve all go hand in hand. Starlink today operates around 1,500 satellites in orbit, which is an impressive feat considering that there are only about 3,000 satellites in operation today across the entire world. Starlink does have plans to dramatically increase its satellite fleet to 4,400 by 2024 and potentially 12,000 by 2026. However, that number of satellites will only be able to support around 485,000 customers simultaneously across the entire US. According to new estimates from the financial analysts of Cowen, those figures mean that Starlink will not be able to compete with established internet service providers such as Verizon, Comcast.
So I like to talk about harms to the global society, risk and issues. And one of the first things that comes up when we talk about satellites is the issue of space junk. In particular, the term Kessler syndrome. What it is it's debris in space. There's so much of it, it reaches critical mass, and it causes a cascading effect of collision to the point that there's so much junk, it makes orbital space unnavigable. SpaceX has said that they thought about this issue initially, and that's the reason why they chose the LEO for their satellites. The reason of that is at the end of life, which is scheduled to be around 5 years for each satellite, the satellites themselves will deorbit over the course of a few months. It's going to burn within 1 to 5 years. That's significantly less than the hundreds of thousands of years required at higher altitudes. So then they're saying is they're not adding to the space junk issue. Another issue with astronomy and the impacts of the satellites on both optical and radio astronomy. The picture on the left, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's an image taken from an observatory in Chile. And you can see that streak that's formed by the Starlink satellites. And that right there is only 19 satellites. And the bottom left, you can see why they call it a Starlink train. And the image on the right is how the satellites will cover over Earth. So regarding the optical issue, Starlink, working with astronomers, came up with 3 recommendations. First one is labeled DarkSat, which is painting the surface of the satellites black. But the issue with that is that it retains heat. Second one was to add visors to block the sunlight from most of the reflective surfaces. And the third one was to maneuver or twist the satellite so that they can minimize the reflective surfaces. For radio astronomy, studies have shown that there will be a 70% loss in sensitivity at certain frequency bands, and Starlink is working with NSF and the US National Radio Astronomy Observatory to come up with a solution. I would say overall, Starlink acknowledges these problems and they are working with the astronomers to resolve. In light of no regulation, Starlink has shown that they are good stewards with working with other stakeholders, definitely demonstrating a sense of corporate social responsibility and a stakeholder capitalism in which everyone benefits. To quote the NSF and the NRAO, they have stated that Starlink, in their efforts to resolve the issues, have been generous and that they want to do cool stuff, but they don't want to do any harm. What this slide is showing is the number of constellation projects around the world on September 2019. Now, not all these companies shown are putting their satellites into low Earth orbit for the purposes of internet satellites. Some of them are using it for communications, navigations, and for connection of devices for Internet of Things. But it still gives an impressive picture of the number of companies that are putting satellites up there. So definitely brings back the issue of the Kessler syndrome. Now let's take a look at the Porter's 5 competitive forces for satellite internet. In terms of threat of new entrants, it is high, as you can see from the previous slide. But in actual practice, how many of those companies are able to afford the astronomical price upfront? No pun intended. They have to account for the satellite manufacturing, the launch vehicle, the antenna system, and the ground network. Starlink themselves estimate that it will cost $10 billion to reach operational capacity. So subsidies, government, and private industry is much needed in order for these companies to achieve operational capacity. For supplier power, Starlink controls the supplier market. As mentioned, the pieces that is needed. In fact, what Starlink can do is serve as a supplier for other companies. For buyer power, the government with its subsidies has influence. The consumers themselves have none because there is no other option if they don't currently have internet access. Taking a look at competitive rivalry, I only list the 4 major entities that have a potential achieving operational capability. The first one being OneWeb satellite constellation. It is based out of UK and funded by multiple companies. 648 satellites planned, 182 launched so far, and the target consumer is the enterprise customer. Interesting to point out that OneWeb had filed for bankruptcy on March 27, 2020. It just goes to show that how quickly cash is spent in this sector, and you need a large amount of capital in order to achieve what you want to. Telesat Lightspeed, that's coming out of Canada. The government has signed on for $400 million, and there's also investment from Boeing. 298 satellites has been planned, 1 test satellite launched so far. With Telesat, they're contracting with Blue Origin for the launch and Thales Space for the satellite build. Amazon Project Kuiper. I would say this one has the most potential of matching Starlink. It's got 3,200 satellites planned and a commitment of $10 billion from the world's richest man. For China, I list China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. That's the state-owned enterprise, and so far has launched 80 satellites into LEO for the Internet of Things constellation. Space is also part of China's expansive Belt and Road Initiative, and so far many satellites and some quasi-commercial satellites have been launched into space. But most recently, private space companies in China have launched themselves. And lastly, for threat of substitution, fiber is currently the only other option. It's slower in speed and comparable and higher in speed. Taking a look at the SWOT analysis for Starlink. For threats, there's increasing government regulations. Currently, the UN only control geo orbits by offering countries a specific amount of license. For LEO, there are no such limits. It is governed by the local regulators, which for the United States, there's also issues of commodities shortages, precious metals used to build the satellites themselves. Much of the supply chain is in East Asia and particularly China. And as mentioned, an issue with the crowding of satellites and the Kessler syndrome. Looking at weaknesses, Starlink is pricing their Starlink kit for $499, but many analysts are saying that the cost of manufacturing is probably much higher than that. So how much of that is cutting into the bottom line of Starlink? Or are they viewing this as a way of gaining customers to sign on to Starlink? There's a question of reliability. If SpaceX ends up deploying all 42,000 satellites, even at a 3% failure rate, that would mean more than 1,200 dead satellites orbiting in low altitude for years. With consistency, so far in March 2021, Starlink has launched about 1,400 satellites. Reports have been coming in that both the latency and the download speed has been varied based on location. Latency is around 31 milliseconds to 88 milliseconds, which is longer than traditional broadband in certain areas. And the medium download speed is around 40 to 93 megabits per second. Starlink has stated that they hope to achieve 50 to 150 megabits per second and latencies of 20 to 40 milliseconds over the next several months as they enhance their system. Taking a look at opportunities, there's plenty there. 19 million Americans lack access to fixed broadband service, and the sector is estimated to be worth $412 billion by 2040. There is applications for commercial planes, ships, and certainly the military. Also, wanted to bring in the financial industry, particularly since we discussed the high-frequency trading case study during this quarter. Now, compared to fiber, light travels 47% slower in glass than in vacuum. A dedicated fiber line from London to New York is around 60 millisecond latency, which is 39.4% slower than Starlink's 43 milliseconds. In fact, that industry spent $300 million to build a dedicated cable to gain 5 milliseconds. So imagine how much the companies are willing to pay for 17 milliseconds decrease in latency. For these financial industry, Starlink's going to set up a tier system in which they are going to be the enterprise-grade service, which they have not achieved that capacity yet. So they're leading off with the consumer base, which is more tolerant for signal loss and slower speeds. And lastly, for strengths, the Starlink brand is strong. They are self-financing. They are not a publicly traded company, so they're not subject to certain regulations and laws, which can constrain their operation. And they have all these listed organic resources. A PESO analysis. Under political, the Biden administration has pledged $1.7 trillion for its infrastructure revitalization program, particularly $100 billion for expanding broadband access. In 2020, FCC subsidized Starlink $900 million to bring broadband to rural areas. Looking at the economics, each Starlink satellite costs $300,000. With a lifespan of 5 years and 442,000 satellites, that comes out to about $252 million a year in replacement satellites. It is certainly covered by its $3 billion projected revenue from its consumer base and $30 billion a year in revenue from its premium service or enterprise. For social, there's certainly a lot that can be accomplished with satellite internet. 2/3 of the world's school-aged children, or 1.3 billion, don't have internet connection. Globally, only 55% of households have internet connection. For technology, it really depends on ease of use and the reliability and consistency issues addressed earlier. For legal, as discussed, there are currently no enforcement mechanisms to force a company to deorbit a satellite. In the US, it is governed by the FCC and the NSC. By placing the satellites closer to orbit, less number of ground stations are needed, thereby having a smaller infrastructure footprint. And the ability to deorbit and burn up in 1 to 5 years is not going to exacerbate the Kessler syndrome. Also, the impacts of astronomy, as discussed earlier, Starlink is working closely with astronomers to resolve.
Plans to spin off Starlink into a separate company have been swirling since last year. And earlier this year, Musk confirmed the idea.
Elon Musk again making headlines this morning, this time with SpaceX, saying its broadband satellite business will go public eventually. Musk tweeting, quote, "Once we can predict cash flow reasonably well, Starlink will IPO," but warning that the business will need to pass through a, quote, "deep chasm of negative cash flow over the next year or so to actually make that financially viable."
Spinning off the part of SpaceX that has the most earning potential may seem counterintuitive, but experts say there could be some benefits.
Right now, Starlink is a huge cash use for the SpaceX business. And if it were spun out independently and charging back, paying SpaceX for those launches, it would obviously boost the revenues of the remaining SpaceX business.
If SpaceX is still the majority owner of Starlink after it spins off, then the company can still see the revenue stream, still see the benefits of that service.
The cheapest US-made rockets were $65 million a pop, and he would need 2 of them. Russian-made ones would have been much cheaper at $20 million each, but with 1960s technology and questionable reliability, the Soviet offerings were also out. It quickly became apparent that people weren't going to Mars not because they didn't want to, but because it was just too expensive. Nobody is standing in line to send $130 million into space with no scope for a return. So the mission to Mars became more about improving rocket technology, making it more efficient and cost-effective than simply getting to the destination.
Here's a great example of the revenue stream provided by the commercial revenue of Starlink, which would go back into SpaceX to fund research and development on their starships going to Mars. This is a miniature development of a space rocket re-entering Earth's orbit and landing on a predetermined pad with a reusable rocket. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed our presentation on Starlink. If you have any questions now, Team Kairos would be happy to answer them.